It is a forgery." The words were a ghost in the vast, silent drawing room, barely disturbing the motes of dust dancing in the slivers of afternoon sun. The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair, did not so much as flinch. He stood before the roaring hearth, his back to her, a monolith of tailored wool and rigid pride. The firelight played across the severe lines of his shoulders, casting a long, flickering shadow that seemed to swallow the room whole. He held the offending letter in his hand, a crisp sheet of cream parchment that had, in the space of an hour, become the executioner's axe for their marriage. "Do you take me for a fool, Ilara?" His voice was not loud. It was worse. It was a low, chillingly calm instrument of dismissal. It was the voice he used for errant stable hands and dishonest merchants, not for his wife, the Duchess. Ilara stood by the window, the chill of the glass seeping through the fine silk of her gown. Outside, a miserable autumn rain wept down the panes, blurring the manicured gardens into a watercolor of gray and dying green. She felt a kinship with the view, everything washed out, indistinct, drowning. "I take you for my husband," she whispered, her own voice a stranger to her ears, thin and brittle. "A husband who should know my hand, my heart." He turned then, and the full, devastating force of his disbelief struck her. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were cold and flat. There was no question in them, no flicker of doubt for her to cling to. There was only the stark, ugly certainty of a judge who had already passed sentence. "I thought I did," he said. "It seems I have been gravely mistaken. Your heart, it appears, is a very crowded place." He gestured with the letter to his cousin, Lord Marcus Thorne, who lounged in a nearby wingback chair, the very picture of reluctant, sorrowful duty. Marcus, with his sympathetic eyes and perfectly furrowed brow, had been the one to discover the letter, tucked away in a book of poetry in the library. He had presented it to Alistair with the pained air of a man forced to deliver tragic news. "Alistair, please," Ilara tried, taking a step forward. The Aubusson carpet, with its intricate pattern of faded roses, felt like a treacherous swamp beneath her slippers. "Look at it. The penmanship is a crude imitation. The phrasing, it is not mine. Marcus, you know this." Marcus met her desperate gaze, and his own filled with a theatrical pity that made her stomach clench. "My dear cousin," he sighed, rising from his chair. "I wish to God I did. I wish this were all some terrible mistake." But the stable boy confirmed it. "A man, cloaked, leaving your wing of the house shortly before dawn." A lie, a complete and utter fabrication, a phantom built of malice and whispers. But Alistair was not looking at her. He was looking at Marcus, his oldest friend, his most trusted advisor. He was listening to the voice that had guided him since childhood, the voice that was now calmly and methodically dismantling his wife. "I see," Alistair said. The two words were a door slamming shut, the bolt sliding home. This was the moment of annihilation. It was not a grand, shattering explosion. It was a silent, internal collapse. The floor did not drop away from her. Rather, she dissolved through it. A cold nausea, sharp and acidic, rose in her throat. She saw her life, this gilded cage of a marriage, for what it was, a beautiful, fragile bauble held in the palm of a man who could crush it on a whim, on the word of another. And he had. He had crushed it without a second thought. She did not cry. The tears froze somewhere behind her eyes, turning to tiny shards of glass. She did not scream. The sound was trapped in her lungs, a solid weight of disbelief. She simply stood there, in the opulent, airless drawing room of Blackwood Manor, and felt the woman she had been, the trusting, hopeful girl who had walked down the aisle toward this man, die. In her place, something else was born, something cold and hard and terribly clear. "Very well," she said, her voice now as steady and devoid of warmth as his. She straightened her spine, lifting her chin. The Duchess of Blackwood might have been condemned, but she would not grovel. "If my word means so little, then there is nothing more to be said." She turned, not waiting for a dismissal, and walked from the room. Her footsteps were silent on the thick carpet, but in her own ears they echoed like the final, heavy footfalls of a prisoner on the way to the gallows. That night she did not pack. Packing implied a destination, a future. What she was doing was an erasure. She moved through her lavish chambers, the air thick with the scent of lavender and beeswax, and saw everything as if for the first time. The heavy damask curtains, the silver-backed brushes on her vanity, the wardrobe filled with gowns of silk and velvet. They were not hers. They were props. They belonged to the Duchess, a woman who no longer existed. She shed the identity as easily as she shed her nightgown. She pulled on a simple, dark wool traveling dress, the kind a lady's maid might wear. From a locked box in her writing desk, she took a small leather purse containing the modest sum of money she had saved from her pin money over the years. A secret rebellion, a fund, for a freedom she never knew she would need so desperately. She looked at the jewel case on her dressing table, its lid open, revealing the cold fire of the Blackwood diamonds. She thought of the weight of the necklace on her skin, as heavy and as binding as a collar. She left it. She left the rings, the brooches, the pearls. She left everything. As she stood by the door, ready to slip out into the rain-soaked darkness, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The strange, persistent nausea she had been battling for weeks returned with a vengeance. She pressed a hand to her stomach, and in the profound, echoing silence of the house, a new truth dawned, a truth more terrifying and more absolute than the betrayal. She was with child, his child. The thought did not bring her to her knees. It forged the final piece of her new self. This was no longer just about her survival. It was about the survival of the innocent life within her, a life that could not be raised in a house built on lies, under the cold gaze of a man who had so easily believed her a whore. This child would never know the suffocating emptiness of Blackwood Manor. This child would be hers, and hers alone. The decision solidified, hardening her resolve into something unbreakable. She opened the door, slipped into the servants' corridor, and descended into the sleeping, ignorant heart of the great house. She moved like a wraith through the familiar halls, a ghost leaving her own haunting grounds. The last thing she saw as she let herself out, a small postern gate, was the light still burning in the drawing-room window, a single, golden square against the oppressive dark. She imagined him in there, with Marcus, perhaps sharing a brandy, congratulating themselves on their swift, masculine justice. The image did not hurt. It was merely fuel. She turned her back on the light, on the name Blackwood, on the man who wore it, and walked out into the cleansing, anonymous rain. The next 5 years were a lifetime. Alara became Era Finch. The soft, pale hands of the Duchess became the calloused, work-roughened hands of a mender of nets and a washer of linens. She had found her way to the coast of Cornwall, to a tiny, salt-scoured fishing village called Porthgarrow, a place so remote it seemed to have fallen off the edge of the map. It was a world of harsh wind, crying gulls, and the constant, rhythmic crash of the sea. It was honest. It was real. Her son, Leo, was the sun in this new, stark universe. He was a bright, laughing boy with a wild tangle of dark hair and his father's eyes, storm gray, fringed with thick, dark lashes. Every time she looked into them, it was a fresh pang, a reminder of the man who had cast them both out. But the pang was followed by a fierce, protective love that burned away the bitterness. Leo was hers. He was the good that had come from the ruin. They lived in a small, whitewashed cottage that clung to the cliffside, its windows perpetually misted with sea spray. It was spare and simple, often cold, but it was a home, not a museum. It smelled of baking bread and drying herbs and the salty dampness of the coast. Leo's laughter filled the small rooms, a sound more precious than any symphony that had ever drifted through the halls of Blackwood Manor. She taught him his letters, told him stories of brave sailors and cunning mermaids, and watched him grow strong and sure-footed on the rocky shores. He knew nothing of dukes or titles. He knew only the love of his mother and the raw, beautiful freedom of the sea. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Duke Alistair Blackwood was living in his own kind of exile. The silence in the manor was no longer peaceful. It was a living entity, a suffocating presence that mocked him in the empty corridors and the vast, unused rooms. He had won. He had excised the rot from his life, as Marcus had so proudly declared. But the victory felt like ash in his mouth. Marcus had become a permanent fixture, his presence a constant, cloying reminder of his loyalty. Yet, over time, Alistair began to see cracks in the flawless facade, a slip of the tongue about a sum of money he shouldn't have known about, an over-eager dismissal of a servant who had been loyal to Alara. Small things, dissonant notes in a carefully composed symphony of deceit. The unraveling began with a book, a volume of poetry he had given Alara, the very one the forged letter had been found in. He picked it up one evening, the dust thick on its cover, and a small, pressed flower fell from its pages. A wild violet. He remembered the day she had picked it, on a walk in the South Meadow. She had laughed, her face bright with a simple joy that had, for a moment, pierced his aristocratic reserve. She had loved simple, wild things. The florid, overwrought prose of the letter had been the opposite of her. How had he not seen it? The doubt, once planted, grew into a monstrous, choking vine. He began to look back, to re-examine every conversation, every piece of evidence Marcus had presented. He saw the careful manipulation, the subtle poisoning of his mind against his wife. The stable boy who had seen the cloaked man had been dismissed by Marcus a week later, given a generous severance to return to his family in the north. Convenient. Alistair hired a man in London, a discreet inquiry agent named Fletcher, a former Bow Street runner with eyes that missed nothing. He gave him the letter and the vague details of the stable boy. He asked him to find the truth, no matter how unpleasant. The truth, when it came, was a sledgehammer. Fletcher was ruthlessly efficient. He found the stable boy who, for the right price, confessed he had been paid by Lord Marcus to lie. He found the forger, a dissolute clerk in London with gambling debts, who had been commissioned to imitate the Duchess's hand. He even found records of Marcus's own staggering debts, a motive as old as time. He had hoped to gain control of the Blackwood fortune through Alistair, perhaps by marrying him off to a pliable, wealthy heiress of his own choosing, once Alara was out of the way. The final, most brutal piece of the report was a quiet inquiry, made to Alara's childhood physician. Based on the timing of her departure and the vague symptoms she had complained of to her maid, it was the old doctor's professional opinion that the Duchess had almost certainly been in the early stages of pregnancy when she fled. Alistair read the report in his study, the same room where he had once entertained kings and prime ministers. The neat, precise script blurred before his eyes. The air grew thin. He felt the immense weight of his granite castle pressing down on him, crushing him. He had not just been a fool, he had been a monster. He had condemned his innocent wife, pregnant with his child, and cast her out into the world with nothing. The sheer, unforgivable magnitude of his failure was a physical blow. He had destroyed her. He had destroyed them. And for what? For his pride. For his blind trust in a viper he had called a friend. Fletcher's final report located her, a Mrs. Era Finch and her young son, Leo, living in Porthgarrow. The description matched perfectly. The boy's age was correct. Alistair did not hesitate. He packed a single bag, left a curt note for his staff, and rode south. He rode for 2 days, barely stopping, the investigator's report burning in his coat pocket. He was not riding to reclaim his Duchess. He was riding toward his reckoning. He found her on the quay. The wind was whipping off the sea, tearing at the gray waves and sending spray high into the air. She stood with a basket of mended nets at her feet, her face turned toward the horizon. The wind had loosened her dark hair from its simple knot, and it flew around her face like a wild banner. She was thinner, the soft edges of the Duchess worn away to reveal the strong, sharp lines of the survivor beneath. Her skin was tanned by the sun and wind. She looked magnificent, and she looked like a complete stranger. He started towards her, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Before he could reach her, a small boy ran past him, laughing as he chased a gull along the cobblestones. The boy stumbled, and Alistair instinctively reached out to steady him. The child looked up at him, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice clear and bright. And Alistair froze. He was staring into his own eyes, the same shade of gray, the same flecks of silver. It was like looking at a portrait of himself as a child, but this was no painting. This was living, breathing proof of his sin. "Leo!" Ilara's voice cut through the air, sharp with concern. She turned, saw her son with a tall stranger, and her expression tightened. She hurried over, her eyes fixed on the boy. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mama. The gentleman caught me." Only then did she look up. Her gaze met Alistair's, and for a heart-stopping moment, the world fell silent, leaving only the cry of the gulls and the roar of the sea. Recognition dawned, followed swiftly by a look of such profound, glacial contempt that it stopped his breath. The warmth in her face vanished, replaced by a mask of cold stone. "Your Grace," she said. The title was not a courtesy. It was a weapon. A wall of ice slammed down between them. "You are a long way from home." "Ilara," he breathed, his voice hoarse. He could not tear his eyes from the boy, who was now hiding behind her skirts, peering out with shy curiosity. "Our son?" "My son," she corrected him, her voice lethally quiet. She placed a protective hand on Leo's head. "His name is Leo, and he has no need of a Grace in his life." "Please," he begged, taking a step closer. "You must let me explain. I was deceived. It was Marcus, all of it. I have proof." She gave a short, bitter laugh that the wind snatched away. "Proof?" she echoed, her eyes flashing with a fire he had never seen before. "I gave you my proof 5 years ago. I gave you my word. I gave you my trust. You threw it all away because your snake of a cousin whispered in your ear. Your failure was not in being deceived, Alistair. Your failure was in your monumental arrogance. Your failure was in your heart. You never knew me. You never even tried." She bent down, picked up her basket of nets, and took Leo's hand. "We have nothing more to say to each other. I would ask that you leave this place. You do not belong here." She walked away without a backward glance, her small son trotting to keep up, occasionally glancing back at the tall, frozen man on the quay. Alistair watched them go, watched them climb the winding path to the cottage on the cliff, until they were just a small shape against the vast, indifferent sky. He had found her, and he had lost her all over again. But this time, he would not accept it. He would not walk away. He had come for his reckoning, and he would see it through. He did not leave Porthgarrow. To the astonishment of the tight-knit community, the Duke of Blackwood, a man whose name was whispered with awe in London drawing rooms, rented a damp, cramped fisherman's cottage at the far end of the beach. It smelled of brine and old smoke, and the wind rattled the window frames relentlessly. It was perfect. It was his penance. His first act was to begin a campaign of letters. He wrote to Ilara every day. He poured out everything onto the page. The full, sordid story of Marcus's betrayal, the investigator's findings, the depth of his soul-crushing regret. He wrote of his empty life, of the silence of the manor, of the moment he saw Leo and felt his world pivot on its axis. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not feel he had the right. He simply laid the truth at her feet, begging her to see it. He would walk to her cottage, his boots sinking into the wet sand, and leave the sealed letter on her doorstep. Every evening, the letter would reappear on his own doorstep, unopened. Scrawled across the front in a strong, elegant hand were 2 words, addressee unknown. Below that, return to sender. The pile of returned letters grew on the small, rickety table in his cottage. Each one was a fresh stab of rejection, a testament to the chasm between them. Yet he did not stop. The act of writing, of confessing his failure day after day, was its own form of flagellation. It was all he could do. He began to live a life stripped of all privilege. He bought fish directly from the fishermen, his fine London coat looking absurd amongst their oilskins. He learned to light his own fire, to cook his own simple meals, to live with the solitude he had so carelessly inflicted upon her. He watched her from a distance, respecting the boundary she had drawn. He saw the harshness of her life, the endless baskets of laundry she carried from the inn, the long hours she spent on the quay with her needle, her fingers flying as she mended the heavy nets. He saw her strength, her resilience, her devotion to their son. He was in awe of her. He started leaving things, not grand ducal gifts, but small, practical acts of service. One morning, after a night of watching her struggle with the laundry baskets, she found a sturdy, well-made wheelbarrow with a smoothly turning wheel resting against her cottage wall. There was no note. Another time, he saw Leo scratching pictures in the sand with a stick, his face a mask of concentration. The next day, a small, beautifully crafted wooden box containing a set of fine drawing pencils and a sheaf of thick, creamy paper appeared on her doorstep. The gifts were never acknowledged, but they were not returned. His most significant act was for the village. A fierce autumn storm battered the coast, damaging the old seawall that protected the low-lying cottages. The villagers despaired. The cost of repair was beyond them. Alistair, without a word to anyone, sent a letter to his solicitor in London. Within a fortnight, a master stonemason and a crew of laborers arrived, along with a shipment of the finest granite. The seawall was rebuilt, stronger than before. He paid for it all from his personal accounts, his name never once mentioned. But the villagers knew. They began to nod at him on the quay, a gesture of grudging respect for the strange, sad duke in their midst. He saw none of this register on Alara's face. Her polite, impenetrable mask remained firmly in place. The change came from the one person he could not reach directly, his son. Leo, a curious and intelligent boy, was fascinated by the daily ritual of the letters. He saw his mother's sharp, angry script as she wrote addressee unknown on the envelopes his father left. He saw the elegant, powerful address of the sender, His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood, Porthgarrow. The words were a puzzle, a mystery. He began to copy them. In the evenings, by the light of a single candle, he would take one of his father's pencils and a sheet of his paper and painstakingly trace the letters. First, the simple ones in his mother's hand, then the more complex, looping script of the ducal title. It was how he learned to write. He copied the address of the man he was not allowed to know, and the rejection penned by the woman who was his entire world. One afternoon, Alistair made his daily pilgrimage to Alara's cottage. He placed his letter on the step and turned to leave. He saw the previous day's letter propped against the door, waiting for him. But this time, something was different. Tucked under the string was a small, folded piece of his own drawing paper. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, in the shaky, unformed scrawl of a child, was a single word, Leo. It was not forgiveness. It was not acceptance. It was not an invitation, but it was communication. It was a crack in the wall of silence. He sank to his knees on the damp stone step, clutching the small piece of paper as if it were the most precious treasure in his entire estate. He looked up at the cottage, at the window where a small curtain twitched, and for the first time in 5 years, he felt the fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. He continued his letters, but now he added something new. He would include a small, simple drawing at the bottom, a ship, a star, a seabird. He told himself it was for Leo, but he knew it was a message for her too, a message that he was still here, still trying. A messenger arrived from London one blustery afternoon with a thick packet of documents. The news was stark. Faced with the evidence Alistair had provided to the authorities and his peers, and with his creditors closing in, Lord Marcus Thorne had been utterly ruined. His properties were seized, his name was a disgrace in every club and drawing room, and he had fled to the continent to escape debtor's prison. The threat was neutralized. The poison was gone. Alistair took the documents and walked to Alara's cottage. He did not leave them on the step. He knocked on the door. She opened it, her expression guarded. Leo peeked out from behind her. "He is gone," Alistair said simply, holding out the packet. "Marcus, it's over. This is the proof. Your name is cleared." She looked at the papers, then back at his face. For the first time, he saw not anger, but a profound, bone-deep weariness. "My name was never sullied," she said quietly. "Only in your mind." She did not take the papers. She simply closed the door in his face. It was the most devastating rejection yet, because it was delivered not with passion, but with exhausted indifference. That night, the world seemed to turn on him. The wind howled like a banshee, and a feverish, drenching rain lashed the coast. Alistair sat in his cottage, the pile of returned letters beside him, and felt the last of his hope guttering out. He had done everything he could. He had proven the truth. He had destroyed the man who wronged them. He had humbled himself. It was not enough. It would never be enough. A frantic pounding on his door dragged him from his despair. He opened it to find Mrs. Gable, the innkeeper's wife, her face pale with distress, her shawl soaked through. "Your Grace," she gasped. "It's the boy. It's Leo. He's taken a fever, a terrible one. His mother is beside herself. The doctor is miles away and the road is flooded out. She needs help." Alistair did not think. He ran. He ran through the driving rain, the wind tearing at him, his heart a cold stone of fear in his chest. He burst into Alara's cottage without knocking. The scene inside stopped him cold. The room was lit by a single lamp, casting long, dancing shadows. Alara was kneeling by Leo's small bed, bathing his face with a cloth. The boy was tossing and turning, his cheeks flushed a dangerous red, his breathing shallow and ragged. Alara looked up as Alistair entered, her eyes wide with terror. All her strength, all her resilience had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, primal fear of a mother for her child. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's so hot. He won't wake." In that moment, they were not the Duke and his estranged wife. They were not the betrayer and the betrayed. They were a father and a mother, united in their terror for their son. Alistair took charge, his voice calm and steady, belying the frantic beating of his own heart. "We need to bring the fever down. Cold compresses. Keep him hydrated if you can." He worked alongside her through the long, dark night. He fetched fresh, cold water from the well, his ducal hands raw on the rough rope. He held Leo's small, hot hand, murmuring stories he didn't know he remembered, tales his own father had told him about constellations and ancient heroes. He watched Alara, saw the fierce, desperate love in every touch, every whispered word. He saw the woman he had thrown away, and the sight was an agony. Sometime before dawn, the fever broke. Leo's breathing evened out, the flush receded from his cheeks, and he fell into a deep, natural sleep. Alara sagged with relief, her head falling into her hands as silent sobs shook her body. Alistair moved to her side, his hand hovering over her shoulder, wanting to comfort her but terrified of overstepping. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her eyes clear and searching. The mask was gone. The wall was gone. "You stayed," she said, her voice filled with a weary wonder. "Of course I stayed," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. "He is my son." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the steady breathing of their sleeping child. The storm outside had passed, and the first, pale light of dawn was filtering through the window. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice barely a whisper. "Why did you stay in Porthgarrow? Why endure all this?" She gestured around the humble cottage. "You could have returned to your world." He finally let his hand rest on her shoulder, a touch so light it was barely there. "Because my world is meaningless," he said, the truth of it raw and absolute in the quiet room. "The titles, the manor, the wealth, it's all a hollow shell. I learned that in the silence after you left. It meant nothing without you. It means nothing now, without you and him." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Alara. God knows I don't deserve it. But I will spend the rest of my life trying to be a man who is worthy of standing in the same room as you and our son, even if it is from a distance, even if all I can ever do is watch over you both." She studied his face, seeing the exhaustion, the sincere regret, the profound change that had been wrought in him. He was not the same arrogant, prideful man who had condemned her 5 years ago. This man was humbled. This man was broken. And in that brokenness, she saw the possibility of him being made whole again. She thought of the returned letters, a symbol of her impenetrable anger. She thought of the wheelbarrow, the pencils, the sea wall, silent acts of contrition. She thought of him running through the storm, his fear for Leo as real and as deep as her own. Her forgiveness, when it came, was not a surrender. It was a conscious choice, a decision to build something new from the wreckage of the old. "Alistair," she said, speaking his name without the icy barrier of his title for the first time in years. Perhaps we could start with a cup of tea." It was not a declaration of love. It was not an absolution. It was a beginning. They did not leave Porthgarrow immediately. They stayed in the small cottage on the cliff, learning the rhythms of being a family. Alistair learned how to make Leo laugh, how to mend a broken toy, how to listen. Alara learned to trust again, not with the blind faith of a young girl, but with the cautious, steady heart of a woman who knew her own worth. Leo, in the simple accepting way of a child, was just happy to have a father who could tell him the names of the stars and show him how to skip stones across the water until they danced. When they finally returned to Blackwood Manor, it was on her terms. Alara, or Era, as she sometimes still called herself, a reminder of the strength she had found, walked through the grand entrance, not as a reclaimed possession, but as an equal partner. The heavy, oppressive drapes were thrown open, flooding the halls with sunlight. The funereal lilies were replaced with wildflowers from the meadows. The staff, who had lived in fear of Alistair's moods, were now treated with a kindness and respect that earned their fierce loyalty. The power and wealth of the Blackwood Duchy were no longer used for lavish parties and political maneuvering. They were used to fund orphanages in the city, to build schools in the tenant villages, to correct the very injustices that had allowed their own lives to be so easily torn apart. The story ended, not with a grand ball or a public declaration, but in a quiet moment years later. They were in the gardens, a place Alara had once found stifling and artificial. Now it was filled with the sound of Leo's laughter as he chased a butterfly across the lawn. Alistair stood beside her, his hand finding hers. He was no longer the severe, remote Duke. The lines of pride around his mouth had softened into lines of contentment. He looked at her, his storm-gray eyes filled not with ownership or arrogance, but with a quiet, unending gratitude. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice for her alone, "for teaching me what home means." She squeezed his hand, her gaze following their son. The peace was real. It had not been inherited or bestowed. It had been fought for, earned, and carefully, painstakingly built together.